putting this story together, I put Carla Garcia's name into truthfinder.com. So much about this suspect was done out of sight, behind closed doors.
The first thing you hear is a woman trying to untangle herself from a name. "I know what I did was wrong," she says quietly. "Now that I'm older and wiser. But back then, I didn't see another way out." Her wrists are cuffed. She's sitting in a small interrogation room hundreds of miles from where this began, and detectives have just told her the life she's lived for 4 decades isn't really hers. On paper, she's Sharon, a retired woman in Florida with a husband, grandkids, church, community, the whole quiet life package. But investigators say that's a mask. To them, she's Deborah Newton, a woman who vanished with her toddler in the early 1980s, turning her daughter into a missing child and herself into a fugitive. A woman who raised that girl into adulthood without ever telling her she was technically listed as missing. For 40 years, that secret lived only inside Deborah's head. Now it's being said out loud for the very first time. A life that's split in two. To understand how we got to that interrogation room in Florida, we have to go back to Louisville, Kentucky, early 1980s. There was a little girl named Michelle Newton, about 3 years old. Her parents were Joe and Deborah, a young couple trying to navigate marriage, work, and the usual chaos of raising a toddler. According to everyone around them, there was a plan. The family was going to move to Georgia, get a fresh start. The arrangement, as Joe later described it, sounded simple. Deborah and Michelle would head down first. She'd start a job, get the place ready. Joe would follow with the rest of their things. He made the trip. They didn't. When he arrived, there was no wife, no daughter, no new home waiting. According to authorities, they were just gone. No return date, no explanation, no forwarding address. Sometime after, Joe got one last phone call from Deborah. Vague, distant, unhelpful. After that, silence. From that moment on, 2 completely different realities formed. In Kentucky, Michelle became a file and a face, a missing child. Her photograph appeared on flyers. Local news mentioned her case. A warrant went out for Deborah's arrest for custodial interference. At one point, the FBI even added her to a list of wanted parents accused of kidnapping their own children. The case lingered. Joe said he kept searching, kept hoping, but years passed, leads dried up. Eventually, court records show the case was dismissed around 2000 because prosecutors couldn't even track Joe down. In 2005, Michelle's data was removed from the National Missing Children systems. On paper, the trail faded. It looked like a story frozen in time. But in another state and under another name, life was moving forward, the new life. According to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and federal investigators, Deborah didn't disappear into thin air. She reinvented herself. They say she took on a new name, Sharon, and her daughter got a new name too. They moved from Georgia to Florida, then Pennsylvania, then back to Florida again. Wherever they went, they put down roots, jobs, friendships, marriages, paperwork. The normal things that make a life feel legitimate, even when it isn't. In this second reality, little Michelle grew up believing she was someone else entirely. A girl with a different name, a different birth story, a different past. According to investigators, she had no idea that as a child she'd been the subject of a manhunt, her face printed on leaflets, her name sitting in federal databases flagged as missing. Decades went by. The world assumed Michelle was gone or dead, and that Deborah had vanished into some unknown corner of the country. Meanwhile, they were going to work, going to school, celebrating birthdays, taking photos, just like everyone else. If you'd seen them at the grocery store or at church, you'd never guess that. On paper, one was a fugitive and the other a missing child. But cold cases are strange things. They never truly die. All it takes is one person who refuses to let them stay cold. A relative won't let go. In 2016, a relative back in Kentucky reached out to law enforcement and asked them to take another look at Michelle's disappearance. They'd lived with the question mark for too long. Was she alive? Dead? Out there somewhere? Detectives reopened the file. For a while, it was more of the same. Old reports, faded photos, dead phone numbers. Then, in late 2023, a new tip finally sliced through the fog. Someone in Florida believed they recognized a woman in their community, a woman named Sharon, from an old wanted poster. Not of Michelle, but of the mother, Deborah. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office requested help. The U.S. Marshal Service stepped in. A task force detective did what cold case investigators do now: cross-checked photos, pulled records, lined up details that shouldn't have lined up but did. Then they stepped it up. To be sure, they collected DNA from Deborah's sister in Kentucky. The sample came back, and authorities say the result was clear. The woman living quietly as Sharon in the Villages, Florida, one of the largest retirement communities in the country, was genetically linked as a sibling to the woman in their file. In other words, she was Deborah Newton, not just a woman with a similar face and a complicated backstory. Once they had that, everything moved fast. The knock on the door body camera footage shows deputies walking up to a neat home in a manicured neighborhood. Palm trees, trimmed lawns, golf carts. This is not where you expect to close a case from the early 80s. They explain there's a warrant. They tell her multiple agencies are involved. She's stunned, asking why, asking what this is about, insisting she hasn't done anything. The answer is 40 years behind them. She's arrested on a decades-old charge of custodial interference and taken to the Marion County Jail. Inside, the life she knows, Sharon, the Villages, her husband, her social circles, stops. The life she's been running from, Deborah, Louisville, a missing child poster, catches up. Then comes the interrogation room. For the first 40-plus minutes, it's just her, a woman in her 60s, in a small cinder block room, saying she's claustrophobic, asking if she can use the bathroom, saying over and over that she wants to go home, that she doesn't know what's happening. Eventually, a detective walks in, a local one, not the Kentucky investigator she spoke to in the patrol car earlier. His tone is soft. He tells her he's just there to get basic information. He asks about her daughter. "What's your daughter's name?" "Amanda," she answers. "Amanda Marie." Then comes the shift. "Do you know her date of birth?" he asks. "I mean, as Michelle." There's no explosion, no dramatic music, just a microscopic hesitation and then a quiet concession. Yes, she knows the date. Yes, she understands who they're really talking about. In that instant, the detective bridges decades of deception with two simple names: Amanda and Michelle. And with that, the secret she's been carrying alone for 40 years starts to unravel. Out loud, on camera, for the first time. No one knew the truth but me. When the Kentucky detective finally arrived, Deborah, still insisting she's Sharon to herself, starts with the marriage. She describes her ex-husband Joseph as controlling, jealous, and manipulative. She claims he wanted an open marriage before either of them were old enough to understand what that even meant. According to her, he took compromising photographs, physical prints, the kind that came from labs, not digital cameras, and held them over her head. "If I left," she says, "he told me he'd show them to my parents." She claims she was 17 when they married, young, inexperienced, and when she had Michelle, she says Joseph's behavior got worse, not better. She describes being trapped, not by chains or bruises, but by shame and fear of what leaving would unleash. At least that's her version. It's important to understand that in 1983, domestic abuse lived in a different universe from the one we inhabit today. Police didn't always intervene, courts didn't always care, victims didn't always get believed, and psychological or sexual coercion was rarely acknowledged as a form of violence. So from her perspective, she says, running wasn't a crime, it was survival. "I didn't see a way out," she repeats. "I'm older now. I understand the consequences now, but back then, I didn't." Detectives don't interrupt. They're seasoned enough to know you don't poke holes too quickly in a narrative someone's been building for 40 years. If you wait, the holes show themselves. How do you disappear in the 80s? The practical question, the one detectives care about, isn't just why she ran, but how she stayed hidden. She explains it with surprising clarity. According to her, when the family was preparing for the move to Georgia, she told Joseph she was going first to secure employment. That part, she says, wasn't a lie. She actually applied for a job in Atlanta, but she also used that distance as a runway to flee. She claims someone in Georgia helped her get new identification, fake documents, different name, different social security number. It sounds like a movie, except in the pre-internet era, it wasn't impossible. Bureaucracies were slower, records lived in filing cabinets, states rarely cross-checked data. After that, she says, I rebuilt a life. It wasn't easy, but it was mine. She insists she didn't follow the case, didn't search old newspapers, didn't check missing person databases when the internet arrived. I was afraid to, she explains. Sometimes when you search for things, traps are set. It's a strange justification, half paranoia, half strategy, and detectives write it down anyway. A daughter without a past. The detective pivots to the topic they've been circling around. Michelle, now a woman in her 40s living under the name Amanda. Did she ever know? He asks. No, Deborah answers. Not even that she had a birth certificate somewhere else? That she was listed as missing? No. She repeats. She didn't know. I never told her. I didn't want to make her guilty. I didn't want to burden her. But then comes the detail that makes the air in the interview room feel colder. She never had her birth certificate, Deborah says. The detective pauses, letting that sink in. Then how did she get her driver's license? Or get married? Or enroll in school? Deborah hesitates, then confesses what investigators suspected. Her daughter likely had to assemble her identity from scraps, using the name she'd been given, whatever documentation Deborah provided, and possibly obtaining a legitimate birth certificate under that false identity somewhere down the line. The detective asks about father-related questions, and Deborah admits those conversations got shut down quickly. She asked for years, she says, about him, about where we came from, about my family. Eventually, I told her to stop. I said it could get me killed. The detective raises a brow. Killed by who? By him, she answers. By Joseph. For a woman who spent decades blending into suburbs and daycare jobs and church committees, the idea that her ex-husband from 1983 was still hunting her across states feels more cinematic than realistic, but detectives don't correct her, they just note it and move on. The mechanics of a second life. The timeline, once she's pressed, is surprisingly neat. Georgia, Tampa, Pennsylvania, Florida, again. Jobs came next, daycare, then restaurants, then financial work at Wells Fargo, then retirement. Along the way, she met and married a second husband, Reggie, who she insists never knew the truth. He loves me, she says. He believed me when I said I didn't like driving. He didn't know the real reason I didn't renew my license in Florida. The detective asks if she ever used any names other than Sharon. No, she answers, only Sharon. Then comes the line that defines the gravity of this case better than any legal briefing could. No one in the world knew the truth but me. No one. Even people who lie eventually need to tell someone. Confession is a kind of survival instinct. But Deborah claims her daughter never knew, her husband never knew, her co-workers never knew. If that's true, she carried a missing person bulletin in her head for 40 years without letting anyone else look at it. Testing the story. Now that her version has been laid out, detectives begin checking for fractures. Did Joseph ever come looking for you in Georgia? He asks. No, she replies confidently. Never. He was probably relieved. It let him live how he wanted. The detective flips a few pages in his folder. Records say he did, he corrects. He filed paperwork, filed for divorce, knocked on the door of the Georgia address you gave him. For the first time, her face flickers. Confusion, maybe irritation, or maybe the realization she's not the only narrator in this story. The detective doesn't push further. He doesn't need to. The contradiction just sits there between them, like a missing puzzle piece that proves the picture she painted isn't the whole one. A phone call 40 years late. The interview winds down. Paperwork starts. Extradition comes up. Her hands shake a little when they explain she'll be transported, not across town, but back across time, to Kentucky, where the case began. Before she's taken to booking, the detectives allow her 2 phone calls, first to her husband, then to her daughter. It's the second call that reveals what 40 years of secrets does to a family. Her daughter answers. Hey, she says, I love you. Deborah breaks immediately, voice cracking, words small. Her daughter doesn't ask what happened. She doesn't ask why police came. She just says, whatever it is, it's okay. I'm with you. Ride or die. You're my mom. Deborah apologizes, tries to explain, tries to say she should have told her. The daughter cuts her off. I would have been guilty with you, she says. It would have been okay. It's a moment that's impossible to categorize. Is it love, loyalty, conditioning, trauma, all of them? None of them? The detective in the room doesn't comment. He just listens. The call ends with a line Deborah waited a lifetime to hear. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. The father in the other timeline. While Deborah was constructing a life under fluorescent lights and new zip codes, another clock was ticking in a different part of the country. In Louisville, Joseph Newton filed reports, called agencies, asked questions, and, according to those records, never stopped looking for his daughter. To him, this wasn't a story about survival. It was a story about theft. One that began with a toddler waving from the back seat and ended with a police report stamped missing. The trail, though, didn't reward persistence. The 1980s bled into the 1990s. Leads went cold. Agencies changed. Staff rotated out. Somewhere near the turn of the millennium, court records show the case was formally dismissed. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because even the bureaucratic pieces couldn't find each other anymore. Prosecutors couldn't locate Joe. Paper files were boxed, shelved, then quietly forgotten in the places where cold cases go to hibernate. But fathers don't shelve their children. Over the years, Joe gave interviews, dug through archives, wrote letters, insisted his daughter wasn't dead, just gone. That stubborn certainty is what keeps missing child cases alive long after the police lose funding or interest. Decades later, when investigators traced Michelle to a woman named Amanda in Pennsylvania and then to Florida, one detail stood out. They said her father's search had never truly stopped. It had just been running in parallel to a completely different life. Two timelines, two versions of Michelle, the missing toddler and the tax-paying adult, neither knowing the other existed. The case that refused to stay. Cold cases are strange organisms. Some die quietly, some mutate, some wait for technology to catch up, but the rarest ones survive because a single person refuses to let them die. In 2016, it was a relative, someone who simply couldn't move on, who asked investigators to reopen the file. And when they did, the case didn't spring back to life immediately. It exhaled slowly, like a machine that hadn't been used in decades. Documents were scanned, names were rechecked. Then, in late 2023, the critical fracture appeared, a tip from someone in Florida who recognized a woman called Sharon from an image that hadn't been relevant to most of the world since the Reagan administration. From there, everything accelerated. U.S. Marshals compared photos, then DNA, then data. When the genetic link matched Deborah's sister, the 40-year gap between toddler Michelle and adult Amanda collapsed into a single point. Deborah might have thought she outran her past, but DNA has no concept of mercy. It only knows truth. A crime without a clean category. The legal labels for this case sound simple: custodial interference, parental kidnapping. But this is not the kind of kidnapping that lands on cable news with Amber Alerts scrolling across screens. This was quieter, domestic, incremental, the kind of disappearance that doesn't rely on speed or violence, just paperwork and time. What complicates everything is that the daughter at the center of it doesn't see herself as a victim, not even a little. She sees her mother as protector, provider, the person who raised her, fed her, sheltered her, helped her make friends, graduate, marry, navigate adulthood. In her mind, the crime, if there was one, made her life possible. The law disagrees. The law says that parents don't get to erase each other, that you don't get to take a child, hide them, rename them, rebuild them, and then pretend the first chapter never existed. But the law also has to contend with time. If Michelle had been found at 8 or 12 or even 21, the narrative might have leaned one way. But at 40-something, the moral geometry is skewed. Michelle isn't missing anymore. She's a person with a mortgage, a spouse, and opinions. She's no longer a child stolen by a mother. She's an adult built by one. And that's where this case becomes so unsettling, because all three are real at once. Michelle Newton, missing child Amanda, autonomous adult Deborah's daughter, loyal, protective, defiant. Most crimes divide the world into victim and perpetrator. This one folds them together. Extradition and the slow return to origin. Back in Florida, after the phone calls, sadness settles over the interrogation room like a thin fog. The next phase isn't emotional, it's procedural. Extradition paperwork, notifications to Kentucky, federal briefs, chain of custody for the warrant. Deborah asks practical questions: whether she can see her husband in person, whether she'll be allowed medication, whether she'll be able to tell her daughter what to do with the dog and the holiday donations she was organizing. She also asks about something that betrays how far her two identities have drifted apart. What happens to my passport? It's a small line, but loaded. She built a life so convincing she started to believe it. In her head, she was a woman with airline miles and a future. In the state's eyes, she was a fugitive with unfinished business in Kentucky. A detective tells her the next steps. She'll be transported. She'll appear in court. Kentucky will decide how hard to pursue charges that predate email, smartphones, and the internet. People ask what justice looks like in cases like this. But the truth is, sometimes prosecutors don't know either. What's the appropriate punishment for a crime that lived longer than the sentence for it ever could? The law says it's still a felony. Time says it's become a biography. The daughter's story begins here. We talk so much about the mother in this story because she's the one who ran, hid, and lied, but Michelle, now Amanda, is really the gravitational center of it. She had a childhood. She had birthdays and heartbreaks and apartments and cars and roommates and bosses and Thanksgiving dinners and probably a favorite cereal. None of those things feel kidnapped, but underneath every one of them was a missing person file, silent as a tomb. When detectives tell her she's technically classified as missing and that they need DNA to confirm who she is, she doesn't panic. She pivots. She asks what needs to be done. She says she wants to help. She says she wants to support both of her parents, not just the one who raised her. That's where this case goes from unusual to unprecedented, because kidnappings are supposed to end with a child recovered, a parent arrested, and the world restored to its original shape. But there is no original shape anymore. The person Michelle was in Kentucky disappeared in 1983. The person she became cannot be handed back to anyone. So now a court and a family has to decide whether a crime committed in the name of protection can be treated as protection or whether it must be treated as what the law says it is, abduction. When a secret finally stops echoing, cases like this don't end with a gavel or a headline. They end in living rooms, on couches, where families try to stitch new truths into old timelines. From Florida, Deborah will be extradited to Kentucky. The original charge, custodial interference, never expired. There is no statute of limitations there. Prosecutors can move forward as if the year never changed, even though the world has. Whether they'll pursue more serious charges remains unclear. The law deals in categories. Reality deals in consequences. Meanwhile, Michelle, Amanda, enters a different kind of process. The legal system needs her to confirm who she is, but the emotional system needs something more difficult. She now has to reconcile the girl she never was with the woman she became. She wasn't recovered at 5 or 12 when reunification might have been possible. She was recovered as an adult who already built her life. In interviews, she said she intends to support both of her parents through this. It's a line that would break most custody mediators. Support the father who was robbed of her childhood and the mother who raised her by erasing that father entirely. It's a triangle with no flat edge. Joseph, her father, has not spoken publicly since the arrest. For decades, he chased a ghost. Now that ghost has a phone number, a husband, a house in Florida, and a different name. What does a father do with that? What does justice look like after 40 years? A trial, an apology, a photograph? Finally getting to hear his daughter say his name without being told it could get someone killed? No one knows. And maybe that's the haunting part. The crime and the question. When detectives close kidnappings, the story usually snaps back into place. The world returns to its original coordinates. A missing child goes home, a parent goes to jail, order restored, narrative complete. But this case doesn't restore anything. It doesn't return a daughter to a childhood she never lived. It doesn't give Joseph the birthdays he missed. And it doesn't give Deborah the version of protection she insists she had no other way to give. The law says she ran. Her daughter says she survived. Her ex-husband says she stole. All three can be true. All three can contradict. That's the kind of crime that lodges into the legal system like a splinter. It's not built for absolutes. It's built for aftermaths. What doesn't fit into a file. There's a moment in the interrogation, small, almost tender, when Deborah sees her maiden name on the manila folder detectives carry in. She stares at it like it's an obituary. "That's not me," she whispers. "I don't want to be that person." It's the closest she comes to confession, not about the kidnapping, but about the erasure. She didn't just take her daughter's name, she took her own. 40 years is long enough for a crime to become a personality, and a lie to become a biography. Deborah didn't just go into hiding, she became someone else so thoroughly that the original version felt like a stranger. That's the thing the courts will never be able to quantify, not what she did to escape, but what she sacrificed to stay gone. And so it ends, or begins. As of now, Deborah sits in a Florida jail cell waiting to be sent back to the state where this story first broke open. Michelle waits in Pennsylvania, ready to fly south, ready to submit DNA, ready, she says, to support everyone. Joseph waits in Kentucky for a knock he spent half a lifetime imagining but never actually believed would come. For 40 years, this case lived as a question. Now it lives as an answer, not a clean one, not a satisfying one, just a true one.